What is an air-to-air missile, you might ask? Well, it's this thing strapped underneath your plane. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes with differing guidance systems depending on the missile you're using. So today, I'm going to cover every type of air-to-air missile in War Thunder and how you use them. As always, before you use a weapon, it's a good idea to understand some basic information about it. For that, you need to look at the stat card of the weapon. So let's start out by looking at a pair of stat cards to understand the important information found on them. Here we have the AIM-7E Sparrow and the R-24T. Starting from the top, we have the total mass of the weapon in kilograms. Next we have the guidance type. Here we see that the R-24T uses an IR guidance and the AIM-7E uses a SAR guidance. Ascpect shows you the direction you can lock an enemy from, while Signal shows the type of signal that a semi-active radar homing missile uses to guide onto target. Currently this will either be pulse or continuous wave. Next we have lock range, which tells you the maximum range the missile is able to acquire a lock. Launch range is the maximum range a missile can travel under perfect conditions. This is not the practical max range you can hit a target. There are a lot of factors that go into determining if the missile has enough range to hit a target, so the practical max range ends up being much shorter than the launch range. Maximum speed shows the top speed the missile is able to reach. Maximum overload shows how hard the missile can maneuver to hit a target. Maximum overload during launch shows you how hard you can be maneuvering when firing the missile. If you exceed this limit, the missile will fail to launch. Guidance time shows you how long the missile will track before self-destructing. And then explosive type, mass, and TNT equivalent shows you what explosive is used in the warhead, how heavy that warhead is, and the relative force in TNT. There's a lot more information that isn't shown on the stat card, but thankfully data miners have gathered this information and shared it to the community on a Google spreadsheet. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in checking it out. Before moving on to the different missile types, I highly suggest setting keybinds for the fire secondary weapon, switch secondary weapons, and weapon lock air-to-air controls, as you will be using these pretty much on every type of missile. The first missile guidance type we will look at is MCLOS, or Manual Command Line of Sight. Currently, the AA-20 Nord is the only MCLOS air-to-air missile in the game. To guide this weapon, you will have to manually steer it using keyboard inputs. To do this, you will need to bind both the yaw and pitch axis for aimed weapons keybinds. I suggest turning off the relative control setting in the control axis menu for each set of keybinds. This will make it so that after you release a button, the control surfaces will return to a neutral position and the missile will stop maneuvering. Using this missile is pretty simple. Aim the missile using your gun crosshair, then use the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. Then you will use the yaw and pitch axis for aimed weapon keybinds to make any adjustments needed for the missile to hit the target. There is a large skill curve with this missile when it comes to hitting moving targets. This is best used against slow maneuvering targets like bombers or attackers, or fighters going head-on with you. The next type of missile we will look at are SACLOS, or Semi-Active Command Line of Sight. These are also known as beam riding missiles. Currently, the only SACLOS missile is the Fire Flash that can be found on the Swift F-7 in the British tech tree. The missile works by having the launching aircraft create a beam with its radar that the missile then tries to stay within. Using this missile is fairly simple. Just line up the target using your gun crosshair and press the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. After launch, the missile will try to keep itself centered on the top of your crosshair. To guide the missile, simply move your mouse to keep the crosshair on or slightly in front of your target. One thing to be aware of is that the radar gun sight can lock onto the missile after launch, causing it to veer off in a random direction. To prevent this, use the Lock Radar IRST on Target keybind to turn the radar gun sight off. Once this is turned off, the missile will fly nice and straight. We will next look at infrared guidance, or IR for short. These are often referred to as heat seekers as well. Early IR missiles used a passive seeker to detect and track the IR radiation from the engine exhaust of the target aircraft. To acquire a lock, you would generally need to see the engine, and for this reason, early IR missiles are known as rear Ascpect missiles. More advanced missiles used an actively cooled seeker head to improve sensitivity. This allows the missile to lock onto the heat generated by the friction of the aircraft moving at high speeds. This means you don't need to see the engine to be able to gain a lock, and for this reason these are called all-aspect missiles. Early rear aspect missiles primarily used a cage seeker. This means the IR seeker at the end of the missile is fixed facing directly forward prior to launch. Examples of cage seeker rear aspect missiles include the AIM-9B, R3S, PL2, RB-24, and the Shrafir 1 and 2. To use this type of missile, we will first need to turn the missile on. To do this, use either the weapon lock air-to-air or fire secondary weapon keybinds. I suggest using the first of these keybinds as it'll work every time, while the latter will sometimes not work. You will then see a circle begin to flash around your gun crosshair, and after a few seconds, the circle will begin to flash faster and you will hear a low-pitched growl indicating the missile is ready to lock on. Then place the target's engine exhaust within this circle. The circle will then stop flashing and turn red alongside the tone changing to a high-pitched growl indicating the missile is locked on. Then use the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. The missile will then guide itself towards the target without any more input from you. If you wait too long to launch the missile, it'll turn off on its own, requiring you to turn it back on and wait for it to warm up before you can launch it again. Cage seeker missiles are fairly short range and fairly easy to dodge since they don't pull that hard, so you will have to learn when it is best to use them to guarantee a kill. Later rear aspect missiles would gain the ability to uncage their seeker. This means once the missile is locked on, it is able to freely move around as long as the target is kept within its gimbal limits. In practice, this will allow you to lead the missile some before launch, so it doesn't have to pull as hard to lead the target. There are many examples of uncaged rear aspect missiles in game, like the mini AIM-9 variants, the Magic 1, the PL-5B, and the R60, just to name a few. Using these missiles follows the same exact process as cage seeker missiles. Simply use the weapon lock air-to-air or fire secondary weapon keybind to turn the missile on and wait for it to warm up. You should now see one small circle inside a larger circle. The smaller circle indicates where the seeker is pointed, while the larger circle indicates the gimbal limit of the seeker. Once warmed up, place the target within the smaller circle to get it to lock on. Once locked, you can now lead the missile as long as you keep the smaller circle inside of the larger circle. Then use the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. One more thing to mention is that some of these missiles are capable of radar slaving. So if you have a radar lock on your target, the radar will tell the missile where to point its seeker to acquire the lock. This won't let you get a lock when the missile would otherwise be able to, and it won't help you guide the missile after it's launched. It'll just simply make it much easier to get the initial lock and allows you to begin leading the missile while it is still warming up. The ability to radar slave isn't shown on the stat card, but can be found on the missile spreadsheet that I've linked below. The final type of heat seeker we will look at is the all-aspect uncaged missile. Examples of these missiles are the R60M and MK and the R23 and 24T. These missiles work the exact same way as regular uncaged seeker head missiles, only you don't have to see the engine to be able to lock a target. With the actively cooled seeker, you will be able to lock a target from head on. Following the same steps as before, use the weapon lock air-to-air or fire secondary weapon keybinds to turn on the missile, wait for it to warm up, place the target within the smaller circle to get a lock, and then use the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. When locking someone from the front, it is easier for them to flare off the missile because the heat generated by friction from flying at high speed is not as hot as an afterburning engine. The final type of guidance we will cover are SAR, or semi-active radar homing. This type of missile works by having the launching aircraft paint the target with its radar. The missile then picks up the radar waves that reflect off the target using a smaller radar dish in the nose and homes in on those reflections. Examples of SAR missiles include the AIM-7 series, the R530, the Skyflash, the R3R, and the R23 and 24R. Knowing how to use the radar on your plane is very important when using SAR missiles. If you want to learn how to use the radar, check out my dedicated Fox 1 guide as I cover it there. I will also be doing a dedicated radar guide later as a few things in the Fox 1 video are out of date and I want to go more in depth on radars than I did in that video. Coming back to the missile, you will first need to find a target using your radar and then lock it using the Lock Radar IRST on target keybind. Then use the weapon lock air-to-air or fire secondary weapon keybinds to turn on the missile. Do note you must have a radar lock before you are able to turn on the missile. There is almost no warm-up time for SAR missiles, so it'll come up right away. You will then see the smaller seeker head circle inside the larger gimbal limit circle, similar to the Uncaged IR missiles. However, there is also a third circle around the seeker head circle. This circle indicates the strength of the radar lock. It'll grow clockwise the stronger the lock is. At around 50%, the circle will change color to red, indicating you have a strong enough lock for the missile to track the target. If you fire before this, the missile will not track. When you have a good lock, use the fire secondary weapon keybind to launch the missile. You then have to guide the missile all the way until it hits the target by maintaining the radar lock. This could take anywhere from a couple seconds all the way up to a minute, depending on the missile and the range you are launching from. The main advantages of a SAR missile is that they're all Ascpect, they typically have a longer range than their IR counterparts, and they are immune to flares. Their main downsides being that they are not fire and forget like IR missiles, you can only target one aircraft at a time, and if the lock is broken while the missile is in flight, it'll stop tracking and detonate itself. One more thing to note, while SAR missiles are immune to flares, chaff can be used to decoy them. If you are in pulse mode and someone deploys chaff before you fire the missile, it'll go stupid and not track them. If they deploy chaff after you launch the missile, do not break the radar lock even if the radar is now locked onto the chaff. Most of the time, the missile will continue to track and hit the target. This is due to people not using chaff properly and not some bug. SAR missiles have their own Doppler filter and are able to distinguish a jet moving quickly towards them from relatively non-moving chaff. I suggest checking out Seekerhead's video on evading semi-active radar homing missiles that I'll have linked in the description, as it shows how to properly use chaff. If you'll want, I can do a video on that subject as well, but I don't really feel there's much more for me to cover that he didn't already. With that, you should have all the knowledge you need to go out and use all the different types of air-to-air missiles in War Thunder. Eventually I'll need to update this video when active radar homing missiles come to the game, or if some of the mechanics for the current missiles are changed. When that happens, I'll add them in and then re-upload this video. Until then, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.